Welcome back, chess friends. It's game number 23 in the 1834 unofficial World Chess Championship between Bourdonnais and McDonnell. The scoreline is 14 games to 4 to Bourdonnais. We're in it with 3 remaining games to see whether McDonnell can make the scoreline less bad and gain another consolation game. So let's begin. We have d4, d5, and now Bourdonnais plays a new move we've not seen before, so a new opening. Bishop to f4, and Morphy, commentating in 1859, says, "This move has, we think, been unjustly censured. As with the best afterplay on both sides, the second player does not appear to obtain the slightest advantage." Well, okay, thank you, Morphy. McDonnell plays on with c5 because he loves a good gambit, but Bourdonnais does not accept. He goes e3, so McDonnell plays knight to c6. Now we have knight to f3, so it's kind of a sort of London system type opening he's gone for here. And we have bishop to g4, pinning the knight. And now bishop to e2, continuing to develop nice and normally. But here, McDonnell just grabs the knight. So Bourdonnais grabs the bishop back. And we continue with e6, c4, knight to f6. So good development this time from McDonnell. Something that we don't always see from him. We have knight to c3, c captures d4, e captures d4, and now c captures d4, and Morphy says, "Black only gains the pawn temporarily, as white is enabled presently to recover it by first capturing the knight with the bishop, and then moving the queen to a4. Well, okay, thank you, Morphy, but we'll see those moves when we get to them, I think. Here, Bourdonnais just castles, and McDonnell plays his bishop to e7, just continuing to nicely develop. And Morphy says, "Had black here moved knight to d5, the following would have been the probable continuation. The bishop captures knight, the pawn captures the bishop, the knight comes to b5, rook to c8, and now rook to e1 with check along the open file. And after the bishop blocks, then the knight comes to d6 with check. And this is just a simple fork and wins the exchange. You can't capture back with the bishop here because it's pinned by the rook. If you capture with the queen, then you lose your queen. So yeah, after the king moves, you lose your rook. And of course, that's not what happened, but thank you very much for showing us that, Mr. Morphy. Instead, we had the bishop to e7, and we play on with the bishop captures c6 with check. So the pawn captures, and the queen comes to a4, as we mentioned a little bit earlier. The pawn is pinned here. After castles then, the queen picks up the c4 pawn. And we continue. Rook to c8, a3, starting to push the pawns on the queen side of the board. And now bishop to d6, but Morphy says, "Knight to d5 at once strikes us as better play." Okay, Morphy, that's not what happened. We have a bishop to d6, and the game is still even, so what does Morphy know? Bourdonnais doesn't want to exchange his bishop right away, so he backs it off, but McDonnell does want to exchange his bishop straight away, so he grabs it, and the pawn on f captures back, and now we have knight to d5, a little bit later than Morphy liked, but okay. We have rook on a to e1, and now queen to g5, bringing the queen into the game, and knight to e4, attacking the queen, so the queen retreats back to e7. We have b4, again pushing the pawns on the queen side, and now a5, challenging them. Knight to c5, which is a nice outpost for the knight because no black pawns can come and attack it. McDonnell just captures the pawn, and Bourdonnais captures back, and now rook to b8. Now, a good move for Bourdonnais here would be to bring his knight back, which would defend the pawn, but he doesn't like to retreat. He goes forwards instead, which also protects the pawn, along with the queen, and it threatens the rook here. But the rook can come to b6, which McDonnell does, which starts to threaten the knight. It also defends this pawn, and it also keeps an eye on this pawn. And we'll see how this plays out. We have b5 from Bourdonnais, and now McDonnell plays queen to a3. And Morphy says, "The correct move, ensuring the immediate gain of a pawn. C captures b5 would have given black no advantage. Suppose c captures b5, and then queen captures the knight, and then rook captures the knight, then queen captures b5. The game is even. If instead pawn captures the queen, the rook captures the queen, the rook captures the knight, then rook to d7, and then white must now win the d-pawn, after which his game will be fully as good as his antagonists." Okay, Morphy, thank you for those. So, indeed, here, McDonnell played queen to a3, fully endorsed by Morphy. We continue with queen to c5, which leads to a queen exchange. The knight captures here. And now the rook captures b5, knight to d7, attacking the rook on the back rank, rook to c8, knight to e5, finding another outpost, and now McDonnell realizes he needs to make sure he can defend this pawn here with enough pieces. He brings his rook back to b7. Now we have rook to c1. There are two attackers on this pawn, so McDonnell brings his rook across to help with the defense. And now we have rook to c5 and then f6, trying to chase away this knight. So the knight does move, he goes to c4, and McDonnell starts bringing his king into the game because he's ready for the endgame. Now we have rook to a1, king to e7, rook up to a6. So now there are two rooks attacking the pawn, but McDonnell has two rooks defending, so nicely done, McDonnell. He just moves his knight to b4, which adds another defender, but also attacks the rook here. So the rook decides to attack the knight back, but of course McDonnell has rook to b8, which defends it. Now here, Bourdonnais plays his knight to a5, which of course completely blunders the game. So I'd like you to see if you could spot McDonnell's next move. And I'll give you a few seconds. You can even pause the video if you like. Let's see. Well, of course, the winning move was to activate beast mode and then move your knight to d3. Now what this does is it protects this square, so the king can't come there, and it opens the path to the rook to deliver checkmate. So Bourdonnais has to deal with the checkmate at the same time as having his rook under attack here. So awesome, McDonnell, we like this kind of play. If we go back a couple of moves as well, this blunder from Bourdonnais could have been avoided if he brought his knight back here, because it would protect this checkmating square from the incoming rook, but he didn't spot that. He played knight to a5, so knight to d3. So Bourdonnais has to deal with the checkmate threat, and he does this by moving the king to f1 so that it has an escape square on e2 should the rook come to b1. But McDonnell doesn't care about any of that. He's just after the rook, which he captures. And the pawn captures the knight back, and McDonnell plays his rook to b5. And this is very nice indeed, because it means the pawn is lost. Should you try to defend the pawn, for example with the rook, then the knight is left to suffer. If you try to defend it with the knight, either to b3 or to b7, in both directions the rook is capturing it. So you have to lose the pawn or you lose the knight. And once you lose the pawn, this black pawn is just a very strong pass pawn backed up by two rooks. And this one is also looking very dangerous. It's just inevitable that Bourdonnais is going to lose. And he realized this because he resigned the game. So congratulations, McDonnell. You've got 5 points to McDonnell's 14. If it's any comfort, Bourdonnais, you have 14 points to 5. You're doing very well. I'm sure that's enough fuel for you to stay up drinking and smoking all night and gambling with your friends. And McDonnell, well done. Good jobs. Let's see if you can come back in game 24 and claim another prize. I'll see you all next time.